Hey everyone, welcome to the Star Webcast. We will get started in just a minute. We'll let folks filter in. So glad you are here. Hope you're having an awesome Thursday so far. All right, I have an 11 a.m. Eastern time, so welcome everyone. Let's go ahead and get kicked off. I'm Katie Nickels. I'm a SANS certified instructor, director of intelligence at Red Canary, and I'm so glad you're joining us for this month's version of the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. Good morning, Rebecca. I see you're here with us. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm so excited to be able to bring in this month Josh and Crista from Proofpoint. They're going to be joining me in just a few minutes to talk about a really interesting APT campaign that they saw, and not just their findings, but some of the really excellent analytic methodology they use to come to their conclusions. So they'll be joining me in just a moment, but if you're not familiar with the SANS threat analysis rundown, usually we kick off with a little bit of a rundown of what's been going on lately. Then I'll pass it over to Josh and Crista for a deep dive. And lastly, we'll kind of wrap things up and send you off with a couple action items. The goal is we want to share information that you can then take action on. All right, let's start with talking about a couple things that I've noticed in the past few weeks in the threat space. It is April 29th, the calendar tells me. I can't believe April's almost over, but been a busy month on the threat landscape as always. First bullet point, of course, ransomware operators continue to suck. No other way to say that. We've seen all kinds of things. And I always joke that like just when I think that ransomware can't get any worse, the adversaries think of a new way to make it worse. We saw in the last few weeks, for example, dark side ransomware operators decided that they were going to try to short stock for companies that they were targeting. So that was interesting. Babook ransomware operators threatened to leak some data from a police department, really sensitive stuff. So that was also awful. And then I think this morning, we saw Babook ransomware operators were threatening to do some kind of open source ransomware as a service. So really hoping that doesn't come to fruition. But on the good side of the ransomware news, a really cool report that I had a chance to be a part of out of the ransomware task force came out today. And so that's kind of a call to action, a bunch of recommendations on how we can start to try to combat ransomware. So links to all of these things will be in the slides. And I should mention that, yes, this is being recorded and these slides will be available later on from the page you joined this webcast from. So links to all of these things I'm talking about will be in these slides for you later on. Other than ransomware, I like to throw in some good news. This past Sunday, you might have seen in the news that Emotet was uninstalled based on law enforcement authorities from a whole bunch of machines around the world. So you might recall months ago, there was a big Emotet takedown, and law enforcement got the authority to actually command any existing Emotet on victims to uninstall itself. So that was kind of a cool victory for a lot of people who had been tracking ransomware, who had worked together across, threat researchers as well as law enforcement to make that happen. So that was kind of a win for the community, a cool thing that happened this past week. And of course, supply chain compromises, so hot right now. We've had some supply chain compromises like the Code Cove one, that if you haven't read about that, that's a significant one. And so what I'll say is on supply chain compromises, these are a very real threat that everyone needs to be paying attention to. At the same time, not all supply chain compromises are created equal. And so, as always, I'm going to advise you all that, hey, let's not spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt in this community. You got to know your supply chain. You got to know third parties you rely on. But let's avoid as a community kind of spreading, oh my gosh, there's a massive supply chain compromise, everyone freak out. Let's share information to help each other get stronger. So supply chain compromises, I'm glad that there's increased scrutiny, but let's try to not blow them out of proportion. So a little bit of editorializing for you this morning. Of course, lots of other things going on in the threat landscape, but that's just a few things that have struck me lately over the past few weeks. With that, let's get right into it. I am so pleased to introduce Crista Giering and Josh Miller, and I'm really happy to have them because I read their blog post on this group that they were tracking in this campaign, and it struck me as one of those that it wasn't just, a post about what they found, but they were great at, explaining the confidence levels they had, right? How they reached that assessment. And with that, Josh, Crista, please take it away. So happy to have you here.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Super glad to be here with you and excited to talk about BadBlood and some of the methodology behind it. So we're calling this Dissecting BadBlood, and BadBlood is an Iranian APT campaign. So my name is Joshua Miller. I'm a senior threat researcher with Proofpoint, focusing on Middle Eastern threats. Previously, I was with Blue Cross Blue Shield, and before that, I was with the FBI. And I'm joined today by Crista Giering, who's a senior threat intelligence analyst with me at Proofpoint. Previously, she was at Nike, and then before that was at the CIA. One thing I would like to highlight is neither of us came from technical backgrounds in our undergrad. We both had social science, and we're very proud of that fact, especially for CTI related. We're also both pretty new to Proofpoint, which is why we don't have official employee photos. So instead, we wanted to share our dogs. Well, Crista has one. That's when Henry was 2 months old, and then now he's much larger and likes in pots. Zoe and Ginger like the couch behind me, and they are great dogs and keep us company while we hunt threats. So we'll get started. And So BadBlood is a campaign. In late 2020, it was a credential phishing campaign targeting senior medical professionals, particularly those focusing from what we saw in genetic, neurology, and oncology research. This credential phishing campaign was carried out, and we attribute it to TA453. A quick note, I'll talk more about this later, but Proofpoint uses a numbering system that's TA for threat actor, followed by a number. So for us, TA453 equates to Charming Kitten and Phosphorus from Clear Sky and CrowdStrike and Microsoft. And TA453 has historically aligned with Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps collection priorities. And one of the things that was interesting to us and why we published on this campaign was this targeting of medical professionals, specifically those three specialties, is not something that we've seen from TA453 before. We see them targeting a lot of dissidents, journalists, people who may have policy or diplomatic experience of interest that would be of interest to a nation state for collection, but we haven't seen the sort of collection before, which is why one of the questions that we asked was, is this a shift or is this just an outlier request? And also, according to what reports that CISA has put out, is that BadBlood is actually aligned with an escalating trend of medical research being targeted by threat actors, in part because of COVID, but specifically this campaign, we didn't find any links to COVID-related research. So let's get started. So, there we go. So in December of 2020, TA453 used an actor-controlled Gmail account, meaning that they created the account to masquerade as a prominent Israeli physicist, Daniel Zafman. And the subject's use was nuclear weapons at a glance, Israel, and it contained social engineering lures relating to Israeli nuclear capabilities. It contained a link to, as you see on the screen, OneDrive.casa. And when clicked, that URL lands to this site that spoofs Microsoft's OneDrive, along with the image for cbp-9075.pdf. So a couple of things about this. Regardless of which button you push in that initial page, it always goes to the spoofed sign-in page. So it's pretty simple phish kit from that point of view. And then once you get into that sign-in page, it's just like Microsoft, hey, put in your email, phone, or Skype. All of these with the exclusion of create one. If you click create one, it will take you to the official Microsoft create an account page. Everything else just puts you back into a loop to sign in. Once you put in your email, it then prompts you for passwords, just like if you were logging into Microsoft. Not super advanced, but decently convincing for some people. And then once you logged in and the bad guys had collected your credentials, it then redirected you to the official OneDrive and the actual OneDrive where this paper was hosted, Nuclear Weapons at a Glance Israel. So connecting back to that social engineering lure that was sent to those medical professionals. And then, so when we talk about targeting, what we saw were senior professionals at medical research organizations, extremely senior, sometimes founders, sometimes principal or partner level people. They were leaders in genetic oncology and neurology research. So as we did our research and into understanding who these people were and why they may have been targeted, those were the three themes that stood out. Also geographically focused in the United States and Israel, about close to a 50-50 split, but definitely concentrated in those two areas. And we see with TA453, a lot of times they may use or target individuals' personal email accounts. For this campaign, what we saw was the targeting of corporate email accounts, which is not unusual for TA453, but just one of the ways that they do target individuals. So if we talk about attribution, we were very clear that Proofpoint cannot independently attribute TA453 to the IRGC. The IRGC is one of the main organizations in Iran responsible for a variety of malign activities, intelligence collections, and a whole host of things. We don't and cannot definitively say, yes, TA453 is the IRGC. But what we can do say is a couple of things. One, the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures that were observed in the BadBlood campaign continue to mirror those that were used in other historic TA453 campaigns. So we saw the same TTPs being used in this campaign that we did see in other previous TA453 campaigns. And then when we look at TA453 campaigns overall, their overall targeting does appear to support IRGC intelligence collections priorities. So like we talked about before, journalists, diplomats, diaspora or displaced persons, that sort of thing. And then also in 2019, the Department of Justice indicted of a couple of different individuals in related to the IRGC and cyber collection specifically. They indicted Iranians that were supporting and had established a commercial enterprise in support of the IRGC social engineering efforts. And as well, they also indicted a former Air Force officer for working with the IRGC and helping support their use of targeting packages and sort of helping them be more effective in their when they were targeting members of the intelligence community. So one of the individuals in those indictments, Behad Mesri, was tied by previous industry reporting from Clear Sky and a couple other places to Charming Kitten or TA453. Additionally, Microsoft has attributed phosphorus to the Iranian government, both for some election-related activities as well as some targeting of international conferences. So based off of the indictments, based off of the previous industry reporting, along with the same TTPs that we saw in other campaigns, is how we made the attribution to TA453 in this case. So one of the things we did while we were hunting was saying, hey, we saw this OneDrive.casa link. Let's see what else, what other related infrastructure might be out there that we could attribute to TA453. So what we did was using passive DNS, went back and looked and said, okay, hey, this IP address, this .7 IP address happens to host a lot of things. It's not solely malicious infrastructure, but we did see a a variety of other OneDrive or one DRV dot and then a unique TLD. And so we started looking into those more and looked and saw that they were registered around the same time, had similar name servers and other hosting and network infrastructure components. But then also the LIR documents that were on those web pages, it had the same fish kit. And then once you entered your credentials and got to the LIR documents, all had national security themes or artificial intelligence, or sort of, you could group them together and cluster them in that way as well, which strengthened that attribution. So then when we looked and we went back and pivoted into Proofpoint's data, we saw that OneDrive.online was used for a phishing campaign against more traditional TA453 targets in the education space. So that then strengthened both our assessment for BadBlood and the TA453 against the medical professionals, and then also these other clusters of infrastructure. That's up for Crista.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Before I kind of really dive into this particular slide and the methodology that Josh and I did for an analysis of competing hypotheses, for those that are unfamiliar, I just want to touch on the fact that analysis of competing hypotheses, or ACH, is a structured analytic technique that's really used by analysts to kind of root out weak hypotheses, not necessarily to confirm like your strong one. You focus really on hypotheses elimination. You avoid your analytic pitfalls with this one, like confirmation bias. And at the heart of it, it really is just to get you to question your initial mindset. In its full glory, utilizing ACH is an 8-step process that can be really time consuming. Josh and I most certainly did not go through the whole process, and instead utilized this as a more of an informal methodology to help us to ensure we were being diligent and thinking through different possibilities regarding intent and motivation. Now, trying to determine intent is problematic for a whole host of reasons we won't be getting into. But as analysts, we really wanted to consider the various reasons behind why TA453 would be focused on these particular areas of medicine, especially when it seems so completely out of character for them. So as you can see with this slide, we generated 2 sets of hypotheses. The first set is really focusing on collection, the what TA453 is targeting. And then on the second set, what does it really mean for them? Is this going to be a shift in their targeting overall? Is this a permanent change? Or is this really just kind of an outlier event that we're seeing? Next slide, please. So here you have our ACH matrix, which is really the next step in what you want to do with this process, lining up your evidence on the left-hand side and your hypotheses across the top. Ideally, at this stage, you would also be evaluating your evidence for its credibility and relevance. We didn't really weight our evidence at this time. We figured we'd go back and weight it appropriately if we realized that we were relying really heavily on 1 or 2 pieces that were in there. Mind you, also, this is clearly not an entire exhaustive list of all of our evidence. We could by no means fit that all on this slide. We decided for our own utility, for everyone to kind of just be able to read this better, we used pluses, minuses, and NA for indicating evidence that was consistent with the hypothesis, inconsistent, or neutral, like it really doesn't apply or impact that particular hypothesis. In a lot of ACHs that you'll see people use C, I's, and N's, or NA. It's really kind of more of a personal preference. There's really no particular one right way. Now, in our situation with using ACH this go around, it can show you sometimes these things really don't turn out the way that you anticipated, and you quite possibly will end up a whole lot more frustrated than when you first started. Just by glancing at these results here, you guys can kind of tell that with the evidence available, it's really not enough to help us eliminate any of these hypotheses. Ultimately, it's showing us that we really need to wait and see and add more data, ideally data that's more diagnostic. This does, however, set us up pretty nicely for adding evidence later as we come across it and kind of continuing through our analysis of, hey, are they shifting any of their priorities, this group, or are they not? Next slide. So for our outlook from BadBlood, and looking forward for TA453 and kind of what does it all mean, we really just kind of turn back to our facts of what do we actually know. As Josh laid out, this clearly happened, and it clearly happened, by TA453. While it could be a sign of shifting priorities for them, We certainly aren't going to know that based off of this one individual campaign. What we are going to be doing is keeping our eyes open to see if they do continue to target researchers linked to genetics, oncology, neurology, or if there are other outlier campaigns that we notice that maybe they're targeting a whole new group of individuals researching another field of medicine. And that would kind of be a nice indication of, hey, they do have these individual priority or individual intelligence requirements that they set out. Next slide.
So now we're going to go underneath the research a little bit. So when we talk about attribution, obviously attribution is a hot topic if you're in CTI at all. But when we talk about sources for attribution, just want to touch on a couple different ones. So we talked about DOJ, Department of Justice indictments. Those are useful, especially because they often contain indicators that you can then tie back to your own telemetry. Treasury sanctions have been super useful lately, both on the Russia side. I know there's a variety of companies that got sanctioned. On the Iran side, I know APT 39 got sanctioned last year. I think SolarWinds and all of these statements that came out as official government statements, they weren't necessarily indictments, but they did attribute to SVR and APT 29. I think that's a good example of that. And then industry reporting. We're a big fan of citing and referencing industry reporting that's been publicly released, using people's names and building on blocks that other people have that's come before. Of course, there's always poor actor OPSEC, which is always great when you're looking at a malware sample and they've left something in it that ties them to their personal life. And then also dissident leaks. On the Iran side, there's a variety of sources that leak stuff for a variety of motivations, but it's always useful to at least consider. So for this, we use primarily the indictments and then previous industry reporting, and then some dissident leaks. When we talk about pivoting, Proofpoint has a lot of data, but we also want to make sure that we pivot and see what other people are seeing as well. So some of the sources we use for pivoting would be something like passive DNS. Farsight offers some of that. That allows you to see what domains have been hosted or tied to different IP addresses in the past, not just where they're at now. Similar infrastructure components using RiskIQ and domain tools. So Kyle Emke and Joe Slovic have both blogged about this in depth, but looking at name servers in common, looking at registrars that might be common, are they using a specific email provider to register domains? That sort of thing helps tie infrastructure together. Obviously, a lot of people are used to using VirusTotal for malware. It's also useful for phishing links for a couple of things. One, it may give you some more unique links that you may not have in your data, but it also helps you say, hey, from timeframes, hey, this was submitted in December of 2020, this may be related, or hey, it was submitted in September, it may be used in an earlier campaign, and that helps as well, giving you a more complete view of the landscape. Any.run, similar things. And then urlscan.io is useful for both scanning URLs, obviously, that you would want to look at, but also pivoting off of specific pieces of infrastructure in those URLs to see if you can tie that phish kit or that infrastructure back to other things.
And here we have some of our best practices that we like to implement with all of our research. As you guys can see here, really one of the key things we like to kick off with is understanding our audience. We always begin with asking ourselves, who's this ultimately going to be for? If we can answer that question, then it helps us formulate kind of what information will be of most use and what kind of format it should be delivered in. For example, with this particular blog, we determined it was going to be for fellow security researchers to kind of advance that greater understanding and discussions on TA 453. Something that Josh touched on earlier is naming conventions. As he mentioned, for Proofpoint, we focus on that TA threat actor and plus, number naming convention. But we also like to consider if we should be including the names used by other companies. And in this case, we did, since TA 453 is commonly also known as Charming Kitten and Phosphorus, and we felt comfortable making that kind of linking. in that particular blog. As far as indicators go, before providing any of them, we really like to think about and determine what sharing that type of information is going to cost us. There's a reason we waited to share that particular information despite seeing it in late 2020. We didn't want to disrupt that infrastructure at that time. And then finally, networking. Talking with related subject matter experts in the industries being affected can provide you some pretty unique insight that you wouldn't necessarily normally get. And for us in this case, it's, things aren't always published everywhere. So it can kind of help you have a little bit more insight than you normally would.
Well, thank you for taking the time to listen to us. If you want to read the report, here's the link. That QR code will also go to the report. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or Keybase at Chicago Cyber. And if you want to talk about ACHs, I will gladly pass your information over to Crista so that she can reach out and talk to you about structured analytical techniques. But yeah, thank you so much. And thanks, Katie, for having us.
Yes, thank you both. There are so many things. I take notes on Post-its, and I kept sitting here being like, yes, yes, yes. And so I'm so happy we have time to just chat about this, chat about your research and the methodology. At this point, if anyone has questions, if you can pop those into the Q&A panel, I will try to read the chat too. But if you have questions, specifically that Q&A panel is the best place to go. All right, I don't know where to start. Let me see. I'll start in the chat. A couple fans of ACH, comment from Rebecca. She uses ACH when she knows she has inherent bias. And I absolutely love that. And I guess one place to start, because I love that you talked about ACH, Crista, is a lot of people think that ACH, first off, we were joking this morning, it's payment information, right? It's financial stuff. No, analysis of competing hypotheses. And I'll drop a link in if you're not familiar with it. Richard Hoyer's Psychology of Intelligence Analysis is a great read on ACH, but the formal process is so long. And I'm curious if either of you, do you use ACH regularly in this kind of analysis? I like the idea that it's a sort of shorter thing that you can do, not necessarily these 7 steps, but I'm curious if you can comment on that at all. How do you apply ACH in your everyday thinking, even if you don't go through the full process? And how would you recommend people do that?
So for me, with ACH, I find it incredibly useful when you're in those kinds of situations, like with this particular blog, where we're just like, okay, are we really thinking all the way through, right? About all these other options that could be out there for why they're targeting this particular, group in medicine. So when you're in those kinds of situations, I think it just helps even just to kind of get yourself to start thinking in an ACH mentality, because inherently, even if you don't go through all those steps, right, it's going to help you. It's going to help you to think even a little bit more critically. And anytime you even kind of do that just a little bit, that's going to be useful, and it's going to be useful for your analysis. I find myself, if I'm going to try to cut down on time with the ACH, I don't do the weighting of my evidence. Maybe I'm incorrect in this. I make the assumption for myself that I'm including evidence that I think is relevant. Now, if I'm noticing that there's one particular piece that is, wow, that's the diagnostic piece for a lot of my hypotheses, and I'm really heavily relying on it, I'm going to sit there and maybe even do kind of a key assumptions check on it and say, okay, what's behind this? Am I putting way too much weight and credibility behind it? And that's kind of my process.
And I think the other thing about ACH is it's really good to do on a team or a group or not just yourself, because talking to yourself about this is great, but being able to bounce things off of other people and get their experience too helps make it more, I think, just better analysis overall.
Definitely.
And I scrolled back to that slide just to bring it up as we're chatting ACH. So I like that. Thinking about structured analytic techniques overall, a question came in on what other techniques do you use and recommend? Crista, you just mentioned key assumptions check. What's key assumptions check, or are there other structured analytic techniques that you really like?
So for me, right, in general, I always love playing the devil's advocacy. But that one kind of can take a little bit more effort, because ideally in those types of situations, if you're going to do a devil's advocacy, you want to actually have somebody who doesn't have experience with the topic that you're discussing and have them look at all the evidence and take their approach. So that can be kind of also time consuming, but it can be also a lot of fun. For a key assumptions check, that's really just sitting there and saying, okay, what's going into this particular either piece of analysis or into this evidence? Like for us, just to take off this slide, saying prior campaigns by TA 453 and other Iranian APT have used compromised accounts for further phishing. You could basically kind of take that apart and dive into, okay, well, what led us to have that as a piece of evidence? Like what leads to that judgment? What's behind it? So it's really all key assumptions check is trying to get you to do.
I love that. And yeah, a question coming in, coming in, is ACH time consuming? Yeah, it is. But I think what you've said is that you don't have to do the full process, right? And you can, something I do in my team is just think about, hey, what are our different hypotheses? Or like a quick, version of like, hey, am I just looking for supporting or refuting evidence? What's the evidence I have? So I think, yeah, it's time consuming, right? But it doesn't have to be. You can kind of do a quicker version.
Exactly.
So Josh, I saw you answered a question I was kind of curious about on the like diving into the, document malicious nature side. So was that Israel nuclear doc completely benign? And I thought it was really interesting. I like that you showed what the documents look like. So could you kind of talk a little bit about those lure documents and, there were no additional stages, clarifying that question?
Yeah, so we didn't see once you entered your credentials, the OneDrive hosted documents did appear to be completely benign from what we saw. It did look like they were documents that had been taken from their original publishers, whether it was the Congressional Research Service or a couple other, I think there's a think tank in there, and they were all hosted on OneDrive, but they all appeared to be benign. It seemed like the goal and the intent was to harvest the credentials, not to infect with malware, which is consistent with TA 453's. Historically, their whole goal is to harvest credentials to then access email inboxes. It is what they've done in the past. And so the fact that there was no malware, there was no malicious macros in those documents further on, wasn't necessarily surprising because that's what we expect from this actor.
Nice. On the kind of more tactical level, so JP asking that, so you mentioned actors not known to target the specific industry vertical. Is the usage of a single IP for this campaign instead of multiple selectors to obfuscate activity for researchers? Do you think that indicates that maybe operations for this haven't matured? Or what's your kind of take on the fact that, there's a single IP, right? How mature are these operators? What are you looking for in the future, I guess, would be a related question.
Yeah, so I will caveat this with, we don't publish on everything that we see from this actor. And we see a variety of campaigns at a variety of levels of sophistication. And I think that sophistication is overused to describe threat actors. But within TA 453, my personal hypothesis is there are multiple teams, some more experienced than others, and some targets are more. TA 453 is willing to burn infrastructure on targets that they care more about. So I think one example of that is from what we saw, there was no attempt to bypass multi-factor or second factor authentication in this credential harvesting. That's different than some TA 453 campaigns in the past that have tried to bypass that multi-factor authentication. So in that sense, this campaign is less sophisticated than some of the other ones, which may just make sense of, hey, these individuals aren't typically targeted, so they're not going to be as suspicious as someone who's consistently targeted by Charming Kitten.
Interesting. And I love that point. That's something that, we often will talk about as analysts of, okay, these advanced actors could use really sophisticated TTPs, like bypassing multi-factor authentication, but maybe reserving those for their, highest tier targets. Like if they don't have to use that, they won't burn those TTPs. So That's a great point, and it'd be interesting to see kind of what happens with this this group in the future. So let's talk attribution and naming. I thought one of the things that struck me about this blog post and why I'm so excited you're here to talk about it is you said that you weren't there with the attribution to IRGC. And I'm kind of curious, thinking about attribution to a country, like how do you think about that? And why did you hold back from that IRGC attribution? And, what do you think that means for your analysis? I'm curious your thoughts on just kind of attributing to a country or, a military service.
So it's a good question. I think specifically for the country, we can look and see that the cluster of activity that we call TA453 uses a variety of TTPs that we cluster together. And overall, that targeting supports IRGC intelligence collections, like we said. So that means, hey, it targets journalists that are interested in Middle Eastern affairs. That targets, and so that's one way we do targeting, or one way we do attribution is, hey, this person writes about Iran, or they just published an article in the Tehran Times, now they're being targeted. That's one. I mean, it's possible that it could have been China targeting them, but like it's not likely. Much more likely that it's someone, a regional power, or someone who cares about what their, if your specialty is Iran, it's not likely necessarily that you're going to be targeted by China or Russia. Possible, yes, but not likely. So that's one way we do that. Other ways, and like we said, the attributions, it's definitely hard, but also we have known clusters of activity that we track to, and we talk with others in the community. And one of the questions from Sarah was, what percentage of commonality are you guys comfortable with to align your findings with another attributed group? That's a good question. And part of what we did for that was talk to individuals at ClearSky, CrowdStrike, and Microsoft saying, hey, this is what we're seeing. This is the TTPs that we've seen. We do believe it's the same group. Do you agree, disagree? And they agreed that our TA453 was pretty much a 1-to-1 match to Phosphorus and Charming Kitten. On the other hand, there are other organizations that we couldn't map 1-to-1 to, and so we didn't include that. There's been some confusion in the past of whether APT 35, which is a FireEye group, is mapped 1-to-1 to Charming Kitten. And talking to them, they'll say no. It's a gray area based off of people's visibility and clusters of activity. And so that basically comes down to talking to people and building those relationships so you can have those conversations and say, hey, this is what we're seeing from our visibility. Does this match with what you see? And do you feel comfortable with us attributing it in that way? Because at the end of the day, we can just say, hey, this is TA453 and not include any names. But that doesn't necessarily help the community and doesn't help our customers understand the threat better.
Yeah, I love that. And, I'll just kind of piggyback on that point and emphasize this is something I've talked about in, a previous webcast in this series of how important it is, right? It makes sense for you to create your own name because you're tracking it in a certain way. But at the same time, right, you've reached out to others and you figured out, hey, it overlaps with Charming Kitten or other groups. So you can kind of explain those overlaps. And I think Sarah absolutely nailed this question. Like, we as analysts should be thinking about how much overlap is there. We realize it's not a 1-for-1, but how much overlap. And, I think of it like a Venn diagram, like some of these groups, maybe overlap a little bit and some names overlap a lot. So I absolutely love that point. Let's see, what other questions can we get to? What else? I have so many things that I wanted to talk about here. One thing that I thought was really interesting you talked about was this idea of the cost of sharing information. And Crista, from your kind of traditional intel background, I'm curious if you can talk anything about how people should think about this when they're deciding whether to publish or not. what are the things you should be thinking about, right? And I think of this intelligence gain loss concept. So is there anything else you can say about your, things that maybe you consider when you're deciding whether to publish or not?
So really for me anyway, right? And Josh, feel free to jump in on this one. When determining whether to publish or not, especially when you're dealing with things like, indicators that you might want to consider including or not, it's kind of like that. Is it going to prove to be the most good, right? If you share this, is it of the most necessity to kind of put that out there? And to me, that would kind of stems from my government background of like, okay, well, does it help us more to kind of keep it private, or does it help us more to make this more well-known and public because you're looking out for kind of like the greater good concept and, kind of laying it out from that perspective. Other than that, it's kind of like, is it also going to help further the research and the level of understanding that everyone else has? Because you're not in a silo, whether we like to think we are or not, right? Sharing our information can be so much more helpful because then you'll hear maybe from other companies, as Josh mentioned, right? Of like, oh, well, wait a minute, we're seeing this too, and we can build on this. And so then all of our greater understanding around this particular threat actor is there and it's built upon. And if you don't share it, that's not going to happen. So those are other things I think that we need to always kind of consider.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add is it's not a, hey, there's you can have granularity with who you share it with. There's, hey, yeah, we're going to tweet it out and everyone in the world will see we tweet it out, or hey, we're only going to tell some people that we trust that we've built those relationships with and can trust to say, hey, you can use this with your customers or for detection purposes, but don't tweet it out and still get those benefits.
Yeah, I love that. And my team takes a very similar approach, right? Like if we're seeing something, we try to like reach out to people from other teams and say, hey, are you seeing this? Has anyone else named it? Is it overlapping? And, then making a decision, because you don't have to share everything publicly. Crista, you were going to jump in as well.
Nothing, I was just going to kind of add on to what Josh was saying, that it's also degrees of right of what you particularly end up sharing, right? Mm-hmm. You don't have to share all of the details. You can share what you think is the most relevant, and also protect your information.
Yep. We have a question coming in on the naming thing. I'm so glad people are asking because this is one of our favorite topics, right? People are quick to link aliases, right? Even though it might be unproven. How do we make sure we use the right name for threat actors? Well, I'll start and then feel free, Crista or Josh, to chime in. Like I always defer to the person who named it, like the team who named it. Proofpoint owns TA, right? TA 453, TA 505, all of those TAs, whoever named it, I go back to them. And if they say it's not how they track it, right, then I would use caution. So use the name of the original report. I think that's the best way. And then if you're talking about it right, TA 453 overlaps with other groups. I try to use that overlaps with rather than aliases. Just to help people understand. I know it's hard. Anything to add on like, how do we make sure we use the right name?
No, I think that's good. And I think it's also good for customers to ask their vendors to, hey, please include overlaps or aliases for what groups you are so that they know as well.
Yep, absolutely. Got an interesting question. Have you ever wrongly attributed an attacker? I'm trying to think if I have any like good stories on this one. I guess mine would just be like making attribution mistakes. My friend Sarah Jones has a really good CTI Summit talk that I'll see if I can find a link and drop a link into about common attribution mistakes. We're talking about Iran. So I used to track Iranian actors back in the day, and I used to think that Mimikatz was exclusively Iranian malware because like Iranian actors used it and I tracked Iranian actors. And so I was like, sweet, Mimikatz is exclusive to Iranian actors. So I don't know that that's necessarily an attribution mistake, but I definitely used to think that. And the lesson there is just, people learn, people change. Josh, you got any, or Crista, you got any attribution mistakes or challenges?
I don't think I have any big ones. I think we try to do like unnamed cluster before actually making a threat actor and giving it the actual name. We try to track it as a cluster of activity first to make sure that we know what it is before promoting it to a threat actor. So we try to be more conservative in that way. I think we see the one thing I would say as far as wrongly attributing, where everything North Korean is Lazarus, or everything is APT 10, or recently, hey, everything is APT 34 for Iran. And that's just not accurate, and it confuses things. So I think that would be the biggest thing.
Yeah, with attribution, I would just also say that it's okay to be wrong, right? Like, can we just be feeling comfortable with admitting when it is something that we're like, oh, hey, new information came in and we realized, well, we made an incorrect judgment. And this is kind of how that happened. And this is what changed our analysis. Being upfront about it.
Can I get an amen? We're hitting on we're hitting on all the core intel things, and I'm loving this conversation. Admitting your mistakes, that's like part of Kent's analytic doctrine, which I'll paste a link into, or if some other intel person wants to paste that. And the other thing, right, about what you said, like this idea of wrong. Intel analysts make assessments, right? We use analytic judgment. And so if you make an assessment, it's never going to be 100% confidence. You know, Josh and Crista, you've used words like likely and probable. And so if you're making an assessment, it's never 100%. So we're going to be wrong in our assessments sometimes. So I absolutely love all those points. And, you know, to pivot on what Josh was saying as well, right? If you're defining your own group or activity cluster name, you're not wrong because you're defining it. I think, as Josh said, you know, where you get into wrong attribution is, well, I made an assessment, it was this country or this person, but it changed later, which happens in Intel, or wrongly saying it was, you know, APT 34 when it wasn't. So a lot of good points. Yeah, this is basically a GCTI study group. Love it. Anyone who's studying, I think we all have GCTI here as well. So love that question. Excellent. Let's see, what else should we dive into? A lot to talk about here. One other thing I love this slide. I tweeted it out. Like, understanding the audience is absolutely key. And I love that you said, hey, like our audience for this blog was other security researchers. So I'm curious, you know, what are some considerations? Like, how would you change what you reported on if, for example, it was executive leadership? Like, how do you think about changing your messaging? Would you use like the same information? How would you change that? I'm curious if, you know, a lot of us have to talk to leadership. Any advice on changing up your messaging for different audiences?
I would say for this particular piece, just because of the nature of the information that we had, it really did lend itself to being for security researchers. And I think you will find that with some of your pieces where you're just like, oh, I kind of want to change it to have it be for senior leadership. And that can be kind of really very difficult to do depending on what the information is that you have, right, to share. Ultimately, what your senior leadership is always looking for, it can be things like, hey, you know, for them, maybe I'd be highlighting more like, this might actually indicate a change in the focus of this group, and highlight a lot more heavily, this is what we'd end up looking for going forward. That would confirm that analysis, or that would say, hey, no, this was just an outlier, one-off thing. Don't worry about it. It's fine, kind of a thing. And maybe more heavily kind of emphasize that versus the other aspects that we emphasized with this particular blog.
Nice. Yeah. One other thing I always think about with audiences, right? I love that you have these questions here, like how will they use the information? You know, having empathy for your consumers, thinking about what do they want rather than what are we interested in? And so that was really interesting because when I read the blog post, I was like, this is amazing. And that means that you hit your target audience. Whereas like a leader would probably look at this or listen to this presentation and be like, why are you showing me ACH, bro? Like what's going on here? So I think that's a really important point on understanding audience. We got a question we all already kind of partially answered, but any other ways to curb confirmation bias or other biases? We talked about, you know, Crista, how ACH is one technique we can use to specifically combat confirmation bias. Are there any other kind of things that you do on your teams or things that you would recommend for people trying to avoid or hedge against their cognitive biases?
I think one of the key things that people can do is something Josh mentioned earlier, bringing in others. Don't just sit there in a silo trying to think it out yourself. And also bring in people who this isn't their primary focus, because inevitably they might actually have a completely different take on it when you present them the evidence, or you say, hey, what about this? They might have a question that'll spur some idea in you where you're like, oh, I didn't think about this that way before. I think those are really important. You don't have to get so much bogged down in specific techniques to avoid bias. It's just really about sitting yourself down with others, inviting them in to question you. And don't be afraid of people questioning you. Like, that's always a good thing. We can always be better. There's no such thing as perfect out there.
Yeah, and I think the other bias that I think is always good to talk about is mirror imaging bias of actors who are working for these state-aligned groups may not think the same way that we do, or we can't assume that they don't operate the same way we do. And so just because your red team does something one way doesn't mean that the actor will do it the same way or have the same motivations. And so I think, like Crista said, having those, even just being aware and having those conversations is a great first step. And bringing in other people. I actually went to a couple individuals who do medical research that I know, and said, hey, what could this like, is there anything to this? Is there any new research being published? Is there any, like, because I'm not aware of medical research, like that's not something I track regularly. And so bringing in those outside experts also helps in that as well.
That's awesome. I actually had never really, I don't know that I've heard of that, right? Your victims are in medical fields, so go talk to them. Like, that seems really obvious, but I think it's so easy for us to get siloed into our own little teams and our own sectors. So I love that suggestion. And right, someone commenting like diversity is key. And I think that's exactly what you said, Crista. Like, having people who think differently, it's not always easy, but having people who question you, and like, you can have a respectful disagreement and say, hey, here's a different way of looking at it. I think diversity in all aspects, diversity of thought, diversity in where you grew up, to avoid that mirror imaging bias, I think is an awesome practice as well. So love it. We're going to jump in, Crista?
Oh, I was just going to say, and for people to remember, there's no such thing as a silly question when you're trying to dive into people's analysis and the evidence that they're utilizing. Feel free to ask away.
I love it. I agree. Ooh, this is a fun one. A question coming in: if there was one technical indicator you wish you could know immediately when attributing activity, what would it be and why? This is a fun one. Like, one choice. I'll start, and you two can think about it, right? And it can be an indicator or TTP. And this is another like super nerdy one from the SANS class, but passwords. And my team will attest that whenever I see a password, that's super exciting, because a password, right, is a human choice. And passwords, I know that like this is crazy, and none of us would ever reuse passwords, but adversaries sometimes reuse passwords. So that's going to be mine. Like, a password, if you see the same password being used in multiple places, like, unless someone like shared their password, which no one does, of course, or someone stole someone else's password, or they guessed it, if it's a terrible password, like, password is one that makes me pretty excited. So do you have any favorite, like, what indicator do you love for any kind of attribution?
I think passwords is always a good one. I think LinkedIn or Facebook account URL would also be a great technical indicator for attribution, because that just could tell you where they work or who they are, and that gets to the person behind the keyboard. But yeah, I like password. That's a good one.
I'm deferring to you two. You guys came up with really good ones.
Oh yeah, I love any of the human fingerprints, right? Anything that gets to the person behind the keyboard. We haven't mentioned diamond model, and like, we're almost wrapping up. So, anything that gets to that adversary feature of the diamond model. Program database strings, PDB strings, are another one that I've been looking into recently. That's a really fun one, kind of an artifact that looks at the malware developer's environment. So any of those kind of human fingerprints, but of course, there are different types of attribution. So as always, right, your type of attribution matters when you're figuring out what's the most useful. So how's that for a non-answer? It depends. We haven't said it depends yet, and we're almost wrapping up. All right, well, we're coming up on the top of the hour. So let's go ahead and start to close out here and think through a few, closing thoughts. And I'm so glad we've had time for discussion here, but a couple action items that I pulled out, like there's so many from all of the best practices and the information that Crista and Josh shared, everything from going and looking if you're being targeted by this group. But I think what the big takeaways that I want you to leave with are more about thinking about your analysis methodology, right? Some of those best practices. Think about your audience. Are you publishing a blog post for other researchers? Are you publishing a report for your leadership? Who's your audience? Tailor your message appropriately. Another one that I really loved about this presentation and the blog post were, right, highlighting your gaps. None of us know everything. And so to strengthen your analysis, right, lean into that. Hey, we don't know this. We don't know if it's IRGC. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. And I'm so glad, Crista highlighted the ACH technique. And whether you do the full time-consuming ACH or just a shorter version, thinking through what are the different hypotheses that I have and what's the evidence I have that supports or refutes each of those hypotheses. So these are some great best practices as you're doing analysis day to day that hopefully you can take away from this discussion and incorporate. And with that, as Randall noted, right, these slides will be posted. The links will all be posted. There will be a PDF of the slides that you can refer to later if you want to read up on all of these things I talked about at the beginning. And with that, that's all we have. Thank you all so much for coming. This was so much fun. Crista, Josh, really appreciate your time and sharing all of your wisdom. And with that, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. We hope to see you next month. Take care.